Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, I'm going to tell you an original short horror story, Odette's Tea Room, written by Cat Voleur. Cat is a full-time horror author whose works include Revenge Arc, The Lore Keeper, and My Apologies to Tanya Grace. She is a member of the International Association of Media Tie-In Writers and a co-host of the Nick Effin Woo Cagecast. When she's not creating or consuming morbid content, you can find her relaxing with her small army of rescued felines. And you can find the links to her social media pages, website, and author pages in the show notes. Now it's time to sit back, turn down the lights, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I read Odette's Tea Room, written by Cat Voleur. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Odette's Tea Room, written by Cat Voleur. Martin had never kidnapped anyone before. Is it considered kidnapping if you tie the victim up in their own home, hold them hostage in their place of work? Martin didn't know. He was hardly an expert. There had been a brief window, in between when the girl had collapsed and when she started to stir, during which he might have left. He still would have been guilty of breaking and entering, and assault, but there would be no kidnapping charges. He spent that time dragging a chair from the dining area and into the entryway turned waiting room, where he had spent so many hours of his miserable existence over the last 6 months. He got the girl up and into a slumped sitting position before he realized he'd gotten the wrong person. "Shit," he said, and then again, "Shit." He had to lift up her lolling head and squint in the darkness before he could place her. It was the serving girl. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense. Once more, he thought about fleeing the scene of his crime, but it wouldn't do any good. It didn't matter if this was the serving girl or the old witch herself. Martin couldn't leave without answers. He had to finish what he started, because the moment he'd crossed the threshold, it had been too late. She would know about his little visit one way or the other. He had to make sure it was worth it. So he retrieved the rope from his bag and began to bind the girl. Wrists first, to the arms of the chair to keep the dead weight of her from slipping, and then her ankles to the legs of the chair. He still had rope left when it was all done. He considered gagging her so she wouldn't scream, but he would need her to talk. Exploring the rest of the dark house alone put his teeth on edge, even if it would be smart to gain his bearings. He tied the rest of his rope in a couple big loops around her upper torso, keeping her straight back in the ornate seat, just to give his hands something to do, just so he could feel like he had any semblance of control. She looked more secure when he was finished, but Martin found he didn't like it much. She reminded him too much of Candace. He reminded himself too much of the man. But then she began to stir, and it was too late. He leaned into it. He called upon the nightmares he'd been having. He stepped into his role. He slapped her face, not hard, but several times in quick succession so that she woke afraid of him, knowing he was in charge. "Hey," he said. "Wake up." She did. The girl who had once served him tea about 15 feet to the left of where she was now bound woke with fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth wide and he clamped his hand over her face roughly. She was a small little thing. Martin didn't consider himself a particularly large man, but his hand was big enough that he could rest his thumb on the side of her nose and still wrap the other digits over her mouth, around to her chin to force her jaw closed. "If you scream, I'm going to have to hurt you." She did one worse. She bit him. Apparently his grip on her wasn't as good as he'd thought, because with one shake of her head she dislodged him, and before he could react, she had 2 of his fingers in her mouth and she was clamping down, hard. He ripped his hand free, skin scraping away even inside the glove which was filling with blood. She was thrashing violently, but the chair was heavy and the ropes held. He was grateful he'd added the extra loops. She was stronger than she looked. And loud. "Odette!" she shrieked. "Shut up," he ordered, but he was hardly surprised when she couldn't hear him over the sound of her own struggles. "Odette, please," she called again. He backhanded her hard across the cheek, which sent another little stab of pain through his fingers. "Shut the fuck up." There was a moment of heavy silence. He waited to see if the girl would scream again, but she only straightened up and stared daggers at him. That he could live with. He waited in silence a moment longer to see if the old woman had heard, expecting to hear a door creak open in the old house, or the sounds of slippered feet on the stairs. Nothing. He turned his attention back to the girl. She looked different outside of the black getup he was used to seeing her in. Smaller somehow, and more innocent. She wore powder blue silk pajamas, which he was quick to take note of. She lived here with the old woman, or was she staying over? He couldn't begin to imagine what that arrangement was. Surely they weren't related. "Listen," he whispered. "I don't want to have to hurt you, but you have to be quiet and you have to work with me, okay?" "Fuck off," she spat at him. He had to wipe her spittle off his face with his good hand. He backhanded her with that one too, for good measure, though the strike was not as strong. If the lights had been on, he imagined he'd be able to see the marks his hands had left across her cheeks, and for a minute, he almost wished he could. But that wasn't him. That wasn't Martin. That was the man again, that shadow of a violent stranger that played across his mind. It was the pain in between 2 bitten fingers that wanted revenge. But not Martin. Martin was a good man. He had only come there, only hurt this girl, with good reason. He didn't enjoy hurting her, didn't want to do it any more than he had to. "Let's try that again," he said, after taking that moment to remind himself who he really was. "I really don't want to hurt you. I don't believe you." He couldn't say he blamed her much, given the circumstances. She had been going about her business, doing the woman's bidding, before he had crept in the middle of the night and hit her over the head, maybe kidnapped her, and was losing his cool to the effect that he had already slapped her twice. That hadn't been part of the plan. None of that had been part of the plan. He was in uncharted waters here, and he was going to have to be patient, lest he start making other mistakes. "I didn't come here looking for you," he explained, as if this somehow made it better. Maybe it did. He didn't know what kind of freak would have ever expected to find her here, let alone break in to restrain her. For all the gothic shit she decked herself out in, she was a soft-spoken girl, mild-mannered and polite. Well, he'd thought that about her anyway, until she bit him and started cursing. "I came here to have a little talk with your boss." "She's not in," the girl growled. He smiled, not because he was enjoying himself, but because he thought it made him look all the more intimidating when he'd revealed that he'd caught her in a lie. "Then why did you call out to her for help?" He rather expected her to admit her mistake, but her answer caught him off guard. "Odette isn't here. but she sees all. The temperature in the old house plummeted. Maybe he should have expected an answer like that after all, considering who the old woman was, considering where he stood. Odette sees all. How does it help you, if she sees? Unless she can come down here and rescue you, how does it help you? It doesn't, she said. But I want to make sure she doesn't miss what happens. That made Martin angry. The idea that the old witch wouldn't use her magic to help him, but that she was possibly, at that very moment, watching him, laughing over what she had reduced him to, well, it made him sick. The hair on the back of his neck stood. Something in his gut twisted. His face felt hot and cold at the same time. Was that what it felt like to be watched? He hoped so. He hoped, retroactively, that the man felt this way for each time Martin had looked back upon him. Or he hoped that the whole thing was bullshit. Part of him still hoped that he'd just been duped by a crazy old con artist, because that was something he could walk away from. He couldn't ever walk away if it was real. So where is she? She's not in, the girl repeated. But where is she if she's not in? Martin asked. None of your fucking business. That was how she said it too. Each word its own sentence. None of your fucking business. She clearly hadn't caught on yet to the fact that Martin had come here with the sole intent of making it his business. He thought it was well past time she started taking him a little more seriously. He reached into his bag again and withdrew the knife. He tried to remember why he had brought it, what his original intention with it had been. He hadn't meant to tie anyone up, initially, and had not thought he would need it to intimidate a woman his own grandmother's age. He supposed it didn't matter. He'd brought it along. It might as well be good for something. I don't want to have to use this. She looked at the knife, a silver glint in the darkness of the room, and then back up to his eyes. He hated what he saw there. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was pity. Who was this bound, powerless child to pity him? You're not a killer, Martin. He gripped the blade of the knife tighter. How do you know my name? You're a regular, she said. She wasn't wrong. Every Tuesday and Thursday since last spring, Martin had found himself in the tiny waiting room, desperate for this girl to bring him in for his tea appointment. He would have been there every day if he could have afforded it, and if it had been allowed. The first time he'd come in an extra day, the old witch had cut him off. In all that time, he couldn't remember ever telling the girl his name or hearing hers. As far as he could recall, the two of them had never exchanged a single word before tonight. But then again, he wouldn't remember her, would he? He never came to see her, only Odette. He only ever came to have tea with Odette. I'm not a killer, he confirmed. It felt good to say it out loud, to know that he was still himself, still Martin, and not some violent psychopath. He was not the man. Untie me, she told him, firmly but politely. I can't do that, he said. She is watching us now, the girl warned him, but you haven't done anything that she can't forgive. Yet. I'm also not a killer. Yet. The girl fell silent so she could think about the implication. She sucked the blood from her split lip. Martin wondered in a brief panic if the blood would give her strength somehow, or some kind of magic. He didn't even know her name, or why she worked at the tea room, or what Odette could have been teaching her. But that was stupid. She wouldn't have access to it this way. This was not a movie or a book. She would not gain strength through blood. It was potions here, and she had none of them. Odette is out of town, she said at long last with a sigh. They were getting somewhere. Finally. Okay, where? She didn't tell me. She's had the trip booked for weeks. When is she coming back? Next Tuesday. Martin could feel the knife begin to shake in his hand. He couldn't wait until next Tuesday. He was already starting to experience withdrawals, but he imagined they could get quite a bit worse. I need you to tell me where she's gone. I don't know where she's gone, the girl said again. She didn't tell me. She wouldn't leave, he said, shaking his head. She wouldn't leave you in charge of this place for over a week. She did. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't trust you to take care of things that long, surely. She didn't. We're closed. I'm just looking after the property. He shook his head. He couldn't believe his luck. The tea room had never been closed. Not a single day. Not holidays or weekends, and never a minute early. It was always open when it was supposed to be, because people needed it. He needed it. Can you make me some tea? He asked finally. You've been cut off, she reminded him. That's not a no, he said, and he held the knife out before him, as if he could command her with its point. That's not a no. Even if I could make it, she said, which was also not a no. I wouldn't. Odette said that you're not allowed to have any more. But why? He lamented. Why him? Why did all the bad things always have to happen to him? Because you're addicted, she said. For a second, he wanted to cut her. He wanted to slice that pretty face of hers for saying such a thing. He wasn't addicted. One couldn't be addicted to the tea, no more than one could be addicted to justice or the truth. He just wanted to see one more time. He just needed one more good look at the man, to see what he had done to Candace. Just one more time. I'm not addicted. I need to. Martin trailed off. He understood how he sounded. He didn't have what one would call an addictive personality, and he'd never gotten into drugs or heavy drinking. He'd have a beer sometimes, on a special occasion, or when he was out with buddies. Not that he had that many special occasions, or buddies for that matter. They'd all been pretty quick to drop him after Candace was gone. No one had been close enough to see him through a tough time like that, though that's the sort of thing one rarely knows about their friends before a crisis. He had a cousin, though, who had been in and out of rehab for the last 10 years or so. He remembered how the family gatherings had been with that cousin, how shaky he would be sometimes, how desperate. I'm all right, he'd say. He'd tell everyone who asked, and some who didn't, and he'd whisper it to himself over and over while he looked around for anyone who looked like they had their life together, who might have money, or anyone who didn't have their life together, who might have a fix for him. I'm okay. I'm all right. I just need a little something to take the edge off. I just need a little hit and I'll be fine. Need. Like how Martin needed the tea. The girl looked at him expectantly. It's different, he told her. They all say that. But it's true, he said. And it was. It wasn't like he was trying to get high. He wasn't numbing the pain of his loss or living in denial. He was trying to move on. He was trying to get justice for her so that he could move on. That was the most he could do now that she was gone. I don't know what you want me to tell you, the girl said. Odette said that you were cut off, and she's not here. There's nothing more I can do. I think there is more you can do. And there's nothing you can do to convince me that I should, she continued, talking right over him as if he weren't there, as if she weren't restrained at his mercy. He brandished the knife. She kept talking, more or less ignoring the implied threat. So you only have a couple options. You can untie me and leave, and hope that Odette doesn't decide to hex you for this when she returns. Or you can kill me, because you can. But that's not going to make it any better. I just have one request. There was a lot to process there. The threat of Odette hexing him, like he was supposed to know what the fuck that meant. The alarming, although somewhat logical conclusion that killing her was now on the table. The request at the end. What is it? "If you do kill me," the girl said, as though it didn't matter much to her one way or the other that he might, "I just ask that you take my body to the conservatory before you leave." "The conservatory?" She nodded toward the hall. "It's down that way. There's a wooden door against the back wall." She was leaving him instructions for after he killed her. Martin didn't understand how the night had taken such a turn. He knew he needed to get the conversation back on track. He had the knife. He was running the show. But the curiosity and the unease nagged at him. "Why would you care where I left your body? You'd be dead." "It's what Odette wants." Martin found that he didn't like that answer. It was not detached enough for his liking. Not what Odette would want, or not what Odette and I had talked about. It's what Odette wants. Odette, who sees all. Once again, he had the sensation that the witch was there in the room, watching them somehow. He thought about the tea, wondered if she used it, wondered what she used it for, if it was to watch him. Even here, even now. He decided it didn't overly matter. The thought of the tea brought his focus back to the situation at present. "How about we don't let it get to a point where I have to dump your body anywhere, okay? Untie me then. You know I can't do that. Not until you tell me about the tea." What is there to say? Maybe she really couldn't make it. And then what would his plan be? Surely you know how it works. What makes it work? "Magic," she said. "Well, I don't believe that," he said. He wasn't sure what he believed, but that was not an answer that would satisfy him. That was not an answer he could replicate. "You believe it a little, or you wouldn't have ended up here." She had a point about that. A rational, sane person would never have found themselves at Odette's tea room to begin with. "Do you know why I started coming?" he asked. If he couldn't threaten her into telling him what he needed, maybe he could make her sympathize with him and his cause enough that she would relent. "You wanted to see how your wife died." He hadn't expected her to know that. But then again, why should it surprise him? This was hardly like going to a doctor or a lawyer. There was no confidentiality clause here. Odette could have told her anything and everything about him. She was murdered. Did you know that? He thought about the man who had done it. The bad, shadowy man in the corner of his nightmares. If he could just see him a little closer, just one more time, he'd have something real to go off of. "I did. It was a terrible thing that happened." He tied her up and he hurt her. She bled out, in ropes like this, because she was stubborn. "Are you saying I should be less stubborn? Are you aiming to be more like that man?" Was he? If being more like the man was what it took to get answers, it would be worth it, surely. "I don't want to be like him. I want to find him. I want to get him off the street so he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt my wife." "We can't help you do that." "But you can. The tea. We can't help you do that," she repeated. "If the tea could have helped you, it would have by now. You've gotten all the answers that you're going to get from going at it the way you are." "You don't know that," he said. He might not be sure that he believed in magic exactly, but there was something about that tea. It was the closest that he had gotten to having any sort of lead, any sort of help. The police had been useless. "But I do," she told him. "That's why you were cut off." "But I wasn't done trying it," he snapped. His voice sounded much louder than he'd meant for it to. But what did it really matter? If Odette wasn't there and no one else could hear them, what was the point in staying quiet? "It was helping me. The visions were getting clearer. I was so close." "You were as close as you were ever going to get. And it isn't healthy to keep trying." "Then we could have tried something else," he shouted. "I know that other people use the tea for other things. For prophecy. For looking into other parts of the world. That's what she's doing right now, isn't it? It's the tea." The girl said nothing. "If the stupid magic potion tea couldn't help me catch the man who did this with dreams, it could help me do it some other way, couldn't it? She could brew it in a way that lets me look in on him, or that lets me see in the future, when he's caught, who he is, before he does this to someone else. That's not how it works." "Then tell me," he thundered. "Tell me how it works." "I'm telling you how it works," she said calmly. "It works through magic, and Odette cut you off." That wasn't a good enough answer. That was basically no answer at all. It would leave him with nothing. What can I do? Maybe it had worked a little, after a fashion for him, because he'd attacked this girl and tied her up and hurt her, and she did sound unreasonably sorry for him when she spoke. You can do a lot of things. You can let go. You can find something else to live for, like Candace would have wanted. You can be happy. Hell, you can let this consume you and wither away. But you don't need magic to do that. It's happening now without the tea. Your life is yours in this moment, and this would be all over. "I don't believe that," he said. He didn't. Odette was a lot of things. First and foremost, she was terrifying. He didn't believe there was a chance in hell that she would watch him come into her house and bruise up her serving girl, and then let him leave unscathed. If there weren't repercussions now, there sure as hell would be later. Next Tuesday, when she returned. The girl seemed to know exactly what he meant. It would be better than the alternative. You can own up to your mistake tonight, and it doesn't need to be so bad. "But I'd still be cut off?" he asked. He might have been willing to take that deal if there had been a chance he could get more tea. "You'd still be cut off," she confirmed. That just wasn't acceptable. That wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "I need you to help me." This time it wasn't a threat. It was a plea. She considered it. She considered him. He didn't understand how this battered, bound wisp of a girl could somehow hold so much of his future in her hands. "I'd need you to untie me." He didn't like the sound of that. She might have all kinds of tricks up her sleeve. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make you a cup of tea." He felt triumphant fear and an exhaustive relief all tangled up into one emotion. "So you can make it." "I'm not Odette," she warned him. "I can't brew it so that you have the dream again." "So what was the point?" "The dreams weren't working for you anyway," she pointed out, as if she could read his thoughts. "But we can try something else." "What can we try?" "Do you trust me?" Of course he didn't. He didn't trust her any more than he reckoned she could trust him, which ultimately was not very far. But what choice did he have? He untied the big loops around her torso first, then her left leg, to see if she would kick him. But she didn't, so he untied her right leg, and then her hands. He stood up as straight as he could, and he held the knife ready at his side. "Right this way," she said. That was what she always said. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. She moved confidently through the dark of the house, to the parlor where she had taken him so many other times for tea. His steps were not so certain, and he had to shuffle along behind her in the dark to make sure he didn't bang his shins on anything or trip over any of the antique furniture. All the shadows blended into one another with the lights off and the heavy curtains drawn. The further he made it into the house, the less he felt he could trust his eyes. It was almost blinding as a result when she opened the tea room and it was already lit with the flames of at least 100 candles. The overpowering scent of the room struck his nose all at once. It was like being hit in the face with it, always so much stronger than he remembered. It smelled like earth and smoke, and every herb and flower one could imagine ground together. It made him salivate. He blinked a few times to adjust to the light before realizing she was gesturing him to his usual seat. He took it, and she took the ornate teapot from the shelf just opposite him. "I'll be right back," she said. He had never been alone in the room before. Usually the girl, he realized he still did not know her name, would stand there with him while Odette went to prepare his tea. When she closed the door behind him, and just him, it felt quite final, like being locked in. He stood and quietly checked the door, just to make sure it opened. It did. He could hear the girl's soft, slippered footsteps walking away. He closed the door once more and sat back down. It was like being in the room for the first time. Every time in the tea room was like that, though. He never seemed to retain information from one trip to the last. He had never noticed, for instance, that the room was red. Maybe he had noticed it 100 times already, but just never thought about it. When he thought about his trips to Odette's, he was seldom thinking about the decor. The old house that had been turned into a business, with its antiques and its odd layouts, and its apparently red paint. More than anything, he was thinking about the tea. Sometimes it would be about how uneasy the old woman made him feel, but usually it was just the tea. Another thing he had never noticed was why the room featured such an absurd number of candles. He had assumed, to what little degree he had ever stopped to consider the lighting, that it was about the ambience. He had never noticed, that he could remember, that there were no windows in the tea room itself. It seemed odd, impossible even, given how many large windows seemed to wrap around the house from the outside. But Martin didn't have time to dwell on it before the girl was back. In her hands there was a cup of tea. She set it before him, and then, circling around the small table, she sat down in the chair that was usually reserved for Madame Odette. Martin couldn't say that he had a lot of respect for the witch or her customs, but it felt wrong to see someone else in the chair. The old woman had always given off the air that if she wasn't sitting in that exact spot, doing what she did, the entire house would fall without her. And here he was about to drink tea with her serving girl, who he had kidnapped, he remembered, just earlier that evening. The situation was strange, but he didn't doubt that it would be worth it. At least, he didn't doubt it until he looked down at the tea. He couldn't have said what color the tea was supposed to be, but he knew that this wasn't right. It was too cool a color, too light. "What is this?" "I told you, I can't make it the way that she does. I can make this. We're trying something else." Something else. The words didn't quite sit right with him, but he was out of options. He had come this far, and something else had to be a whole hell of a lot better than nothing. What will it do? She gave him a curious look then, somewhere between a challenge and a smile. "Let's see, shall we?" He didn't like that answer. Didn't like it at all. But Odette had not exactly been forthcoming in what the precise effects of her tea would be either, and they were the closest thing he had to answers yet. So he drank. He'd gotten accustomed to the aggressive, almost bitter taste of what Madame Odette offered. Though his first cup had been hard to keep down, the tea had been on his mind so often lately that he'd started craving it. This was a nicer replacement for sure, not so much of an acquired taste. It was crisp, fresh, with a light natural sweetness that made it welcoming. Forgetting his misgivings about the effects, he downed the cup easily. The girl watched him swallow from the other side of the table, and said nothing. He stood up, and she frowned. "Where are you going?" Where was he going? Usually when he finished choking down a cup, he would cough his way out of the tea room and head home, chasing the foul beverage with Jack to try and lull himself to sleep faster so he could experience the dream as soon as possible. But it felt a little absurd to race home in the middle of a kidnapping, a word which no longer felt entirely applicable to the situation in which he found himself. For one thing, that would mean it was over. For another, he wasn't sure that whatever magic she had given him would even work in his sleep. "Sit down," she told him. So he did. Did you ever wonder what the other people used the tea for? He hadn't, of course, not until he'd brought up earlier when begging for scraps. Like every other element of his experience in the tea room, his brain power went all to his own purpose for being there. "Not really," he admitted. "There is so much more on the menu than what you have ever realized. So many gifts you might have asked for." Because Martin no longer felt in charge of the situation, or because the girl had sparked some matter of curiosity in him, he asked, "Like what?" "Many things," she said. "You guessed a few tonight. Scrying, divination, glamours." He wasn't sure if it was the tea or the candle smoke in the poorly ventilated room, but it was getting harder for him to focus. He was sure he'd misheard. "Glamours. We offer tea for beauty," she explained. "Confidence. That's the easiest kind to brew, you know. It's easy to make you see yourself the way that someone else sees you. That can offer clarity. It can make you feel beautiful through the right lens." Frivolous things compared to what he was after. He couldn't imagine that they were worth the price of admission. "I don't need to feel beautiful," he said. It was such a silly sentence even, coming from him, a broken man who was having to set reminders for himself when he was supposed to bathe and shower and change his clothes. The words almost didn't leave his lips for how unimportant they felt, and how heavy his face was. "Maybe that would have fixed you, Martin," the serving girl told him. "Seeing yourself through another pair of eyes. It might have made you feel like you were worth something, even with your wife gone." He objected to that, or rather, he wanted to. He wanted to tell her that she didn't know what she was talking about, and that feeling better about himself wouldn't be enough to stop the underlying issue. But he couldn't talk at all. "If you had come in here and asked Odette for her help, you could have left a better person. But you came in and told her what you wanted, what you thought was best, and you didn't listen when she tried to stop you." There was a tightening in his chest as he tried to force his muscles into action, but they weren't having it. All that happened was the panic rose. "And then you came here ready to what? To threaten her?" He didn't know. He would have done anything to get his hands on that tea, to have the dream one more time. Martin was certain that one more time was all he needed, and it all would have been worth it. "Do you think if you had caught her here, she would have been any more inclined to help you than I was?" "I think not. She cut you off for a reason." He tried to explain how close he had been, how he had gotten a little desperate, maybe a little heated with Madame Odette, but that didn't mean he was a bad person. The fact that he had broken in here didn't mean that he was a bad person. He was just in a desperate spot to get what he needed. And he was so close. If only Martin could have explained to her how close he was to catching the man who had murdered his wife. But he couldn't explain anything. He couldn't speak or move, and it was getting harder and harder just to keep his body upright. Whatever the girl had fed him, and he didn't think it was a potion any longer, was making him heavy more than it was paralyzing him. "I'm sorry that it had to end this way, Martin," she told him. To the girl's credit, she did sound sorry. "But I want you to remember that I gave you the chance to go home." She had given him that, but she had to see that he hadn't been able to take it. Nothing was worth walking away from the tea room empty-handed. Nothing. Even if the girl had offered again, even in that last moment before he blacked out, Martin would not have been able to take it. Martin did not dream. He didn't have a bird's-eye view of his wife being tied up. He couldn't hear the faint whimpering sound that she made into the makeshift gag that had been tied around her lips. He couldn't see the faint, pale scars on the fingers of the man that wiped the tears off her cheek. He could not squint into the shadows as the knife went into her skin again and again, to try and make out the identity of the man responsible. He couldn't smell the blood. Martin couldn't even cry for her a final time. His dream was nothing. Martin wasn't quite sure what he was looking at when he awoke. He thought maybe he was back in the tea room, because it was the last place he could remember being, and this room was a similar shade of crimson. Such an angry color for such a peaceful room. It wasn't until his vision cleared a little, and he saw the light filtering in from above, that he realized he wasn't in the tea room at all. He tried to sit up, but it was useless. He regained the functionality of his limbs, but there was such a blinding pain in his head when he tried to move, that he was forced not only to lay flat on his back, but to close his eyes as well. It took a minute for the horror to sink in, but he got there. Once the pain had receded to a dull ache, and the nausea had settled, Martin realized he could still see perfectly well. The two eyes in his head were tightly closed, however. It was almost like an out-of-body experience where he was looking down at himself from the walls of the room that was not the tea room, but that wasn't quite right either. In an out-of-body experience, one is typically looking down at themselves from a single angle above the scene. This was something else entirely. He shut his eyes tighter and tried to figure out what was so off about the scene, aside from the fact that it was happening at all. His brain was slow to process the unprecedented amount of information being sent to it, but after several minutes of struggle and many deep breaths, he got there. Martin was looking down at himself not from a centered location, but from several points, forming a 360-degree circle around his body. He wondered if he was dead, but there was too much noise thrumming in his brain for him to be dead. Too much static. Too much pressure. "Hello?" he tried to call. The sound was more of a rasp than a voice, but it was enough to send a small vibration out from his body, and into. Martin wasn't sure. It felt like the rest of his body, only it was all over the place, all around the walls, looking down at him. He wondered if this was what madness felt like. Then, with hope, he realized it was probably what magic felt like. He hadn't been able to see the man in his dream, but the girl had promised to help him in a different way. She had spoken of the different teas offering different perspectives. Perhaps that was exactly what she had meant. He could feel it in his walls as the hope elevated his heart rate, pumping blood into all these new bits of him. If he could get different perspectives in his dream like he was getting now, it would be quite easy for him to get a better look at the man's face. He didn't know how to get up, to find the girl, or tell her that it was working, but he felt certain that it was. If only he could have that dream again. First thing was, he was going to have to figure out how this new power worked that the tea had given him. Since he was already adept at focusing on his body, spread out on the floor, he decided to concentrate and see if he could make out anything more. It would be important that these new points of vision were able to take in as many details as possible if they were to be his best tools at identifying the man. The things he noticed upon looking more carefully at his body upset him greatly. He was lying spread-eagled on the floor, which was easier for him to see than it was to feel, not something that boded particularly well in his opinion. The other big surprise was that he was bound to the floor. He tried to squint, which proved beyond his current capabilities with the new sight. That meant he was still unable to make out the dark strands around his wrists and ankles in the relative darkness of the room. They were shadowy and thin, and didn't seem like they'd be able to hold him, but they were. He couldn't pull his limbs in closer, or gain the leverage to sit up. It was a strange feeling, straining his muscles in one place and watching from another as his body writhed weakly on the floor. The better his new vision became, the heavier his body felt and the harder it became to move. This should have alarmed him more, but his senses were too overwhelmed by this new perspective. Once he'd gotten a good look at himself, he realized he could get a good look at the rest of the red room. No sooner had he started to turn his vision around than he had wished he hadn't. It was a sort of green room he was in, made of frosted glass, lit only by the moon and stars of the partially obstructed night sky above. The walls were not painted red, but rather they were coated in a sort of earthy moss that grew in between the pulsing red web of the strange plants that blossomed there. Where he might have expected to see flower or herbs that fueled the tea room, Martin saw only wet, bulbous spheres. And when his vision came into focus with one, he found he recognized himself in two places from both sides of the room, staring at himself. Eyes, he realized with horror. The plants growing in the room were eyes, and he could see through them, with them. He tried to open his two eyes and found himself getting dizzy as his brain failed to locate them. In just a matter of minutes, his nervous system had forgotten which eyes belonged to him. Even when he had reoriented himself more or less back in his body, the eyelids felt too heavy to open. He figured that was okay. He didn't need to open his eyes to see, and he didn't even really need to see to move. He strained to sit up, pulling the wet vines along the floor with his limbs. The plants, or the one singular massive plant that covered the walls, rustled in his struggles. He tugged harder, trying to free himself, and found that there was pain. It didn't come from him, but from the flora around him. It was part of a body now, and he was trying to rip it from its host. The understanding came in waves, but it didn't come from his own brain. It came from the red leaves, pouring their knowledge back into his physical form from the hive mind, inviting him to succumb to their ranks. The girl had wanted her body to be dropped in the conservatory. The powers she had promised were all matters of perspective. Madame Odette could see all. The taste, the earthy, metallic, thick taste of her teas. He started to understand, not with words, but with some peculiar kind of muscle memory, how the witch got her powers, and what potions were made of. He understood, too, how the eyes were fed. As his human body on the floor grew weaker, his plant body all around grew stronger. It could revel in that earthy taste of the blood once more through its vines. Some panic response in the fading electrical signals of his brain told the plant to stop drinking. But even when he tried to obey, there were countless other signals in the organic web. They were thirsty, and his voice was lost. And then Martin wasn't a he anymore. He wasn't even an it. He was but a single part of a they. The plant was a culmination of all those who had been absorbed before, a forsaken chorus of the lost with no mouth to sing. All that had made Martin an individual man was sucked up into the roots of another kind of being entirely. Candace's name was lost. The silhouette of the man who had killed her was lost. The desire to have a specific dream finally faded once the desire for justice was gone. The witch herself came to move the clothes that would not on their own decay, by which point the consciousness in the vines had forgotten the name of its most recent addition. Sometimes the girl came in to harvest one of the eyes, and there would be a sharp burst of pain, a shudder through the system that was then forgotten. All that lingered after was the thirst, a desperate addiction to a drink that had been worth dying over, worth being absorbed over. But it would be okay. One day, each eye, regardless of who it had been in life, would be plucked, chosen to have its final drink. One day, each of them would make it back home, to Madame Odette's tea room. What did you think of this terrific original horror story? Comment or email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Cat for submitting and entrusting me with her work. And as a reminder, you can find the links to her social media pages, website, and more in the show notes. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, Make sure to join me next time as we continue exploring our strange and scary world. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.